Welcome to the workshop entitled Crisis and Fragility of Democracy in the World, a preamble to the Second Assembly of the International Association of Jesuit Universities, the IAJU. This workshop will consist of 3 moments. Firstly, we will watch a video presentation by Father General Arturo Sosa, who assigned AUSJAL the development of an Observatory on Democracy, an initiative made part of the association's advocacy agenda. This assignment was entrusted to us in November 2021 during our 22nd Assembly, celebrated in Montevideo. Secondly, our Latin American Association will present the observatory we have developed, and we will listen to the feedback from Dr. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights, and from Father and Dr. Matthew Carnes from the Society of Jesus and Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. Finally, and after a brief recess, we will listen to a representative of each association conforming IAJU, expose the challenges of democracy in the regions, and discuss our alternatives to face together these demands as a worldwide university network. In this matter, let us begin presenting Father General's assignment to AUSJAL. Could you please project it?
Queridos rectores de las universidades encomendadas a la Compañía de Jesús en América Latina, es un gusto estar con ustedes en esta mañana en que la asociación realiza su primera reunión presencial desde que fue necesario asumir medidas sanitarias restrictivas por la crisis provocada por la pandemia del COVID-19. Hace poco menos de un año tuve el agrado de encontrarme con ustedes también a distancia con motivo del 35 aniversario de AUSJAL, cuando fui invitado como testigo de honor a la firma del Pacto Educativo Global convocado por el Papa Francisco. Hoy inauguro la 22ª Asamblea de AUSJAL. Celebro la creciente colaboración entre sus miembros y les propongo profundizar su incidencia socioambiental para el servicio de la justicia y la reconciliación entre nosotros, con nuestra casa común y con el Dios de la vida. La experiencia de AUSJAL viene confirmando que la colaboración entre personas e instituciones diversas nos permite enfrentar los problemas locales desde una perspectiva global y viceversa, gracias a la información, planificación y evaluación que las redes permiten compartir. A propósito de este contexto, el pasado 30 de septiembre, con motivo de la presentación del libro Crisis y desencanto con la democracia en América Latina, tuve la oportunidad de compartir con ustedes un mensaje en el que destaqué la importancia de fundar un observatorio permanente de democracia para la región, desde el cual se dé seguimiento a nuestros problemas sociopolíticos, se evalúen tendencias y se orienten las transformaciones que lleven a la democratización de la política en los países de América Latina y el Caribe. El observatorio forma parte de la agenda de incidencia pública universitaria que será propuesta el día de hoy a la Asamblea de AUSJAL. La agenda se desprende del plan estratégico de AUSJAL, en sintonía con el segundo plan apostólico común de la Conferencia de Provinciales Jesuitas de América Latina y el Caribe. Los grandes núcleos de temas propuestos con el fin de luego convertirlos en programas de trabajo son los siguientes. Primero, la sustentabilidad del hábitat, el reordenamiento responsable, el desarrollo de la economía verde, el cuidado de nuestros ecosistemas y de nuestros pueblos originarios, con especial énfasis en la Panamazonía. Segundo, el fortalecimiento democrático de los estados y de la soberanía ciudadana en favor de sistemas de representación real y de participación organizada de la población en las decisiones que le incumben y afectan en todos y cada uno de los países de la región. Tercero, el desarrollo con inclusión e igualdad, que abarca la atención a la exclusión social, la desigualdad, la reducción de la pobreza, la vulnerabilidad, la nutrición y el acceso a los bienes culturales para todos y todas. Cuarto, las acciones a las que nos comprometimos al firmar el Pacto Educativo Global y el enfoque de derecho universal a una educación de calidad, promovido por la Conferencia de Provinciales Jesuitas en América Latina y el Caribe. Quinto, la reactivación económica de la región con crecimiento y desarrollo económico y social, lo cual involucra el afianzamiento de la seguridad ciudadana en nuestros países contra tantas formas de violencia presentes, poner el respeto irrestricto a los derechos humanos, la justicia y la reconciliación social al centro de los objetivos políticos y así avanzar a una auténtica cultura de paz. Sexto, la atención a las poblaciones en movilidad forzada, refugiados y migrantes, así como a la infancia, a la población LGBTI, a los trabajadores temporales, entre otros. Incluye acciones educativas, sanitarias, de promoción humana, de gestión política y de atención jurídica. Como ven, mucho trabajo por delante para este observatorio. Pido pues al Señor que le conceda a AUSJAL, según el marco de la agenda de incidencia pública planteada, responder al clamor de la tierra, al clamor de los pobres y el de las comunidades locales, impulsando una economía ecológica, estilos de vida sostenibles, una educación en la sustentabilidad y una espiritualidad reconciliada con la casa común. Les deseo una excelente reunión. Muchas gracias.
This opening workshop is coincident in time with the closing of the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador. Thus, let me introduce you to Jimena Dávila, Director of International Relations of this university. She will coordinate our first panel.
Thank you, Francisco. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here today on behalf of Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador. As these past weeks, our university and our rector, Fernando Ponce León, along the Ecuadorian Church and two Ecuadorian universities are promoting and facilitating dialogue between the indigenous movement and the Ecuadorian government to develop a more consensual public policy about several issues of national interest. Involvement that improves the role of the church and the universities as civil actors is crucial in the process of consolidating democracy. Our first panelist in this workshop is Dr. Luis Arriaga. He is the president, wait, I just lost the profile, sorry. Technical issues, I'm so sorry. Okay. He is the president of the Association of Jesuit Universities in Latin America, AUSJAL, and the president of Iberoamericana University in Mexico. He is a Jesuit priest, lawyer, and doctor of education. Throughout his academic and professional career, he has specialized in human rights. He has been the rector of the Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Occidente y TESO, the Jesuit University of Guadalajara. Welcome. Our second panelist is Dr. Ángel Álvarez, who is a researcher of the Andrés Bello Catholic University in Venezuela and coordinator of AUSJAL Observatorio on Democracy. Ángel holds a PhD in political science and government. He's a public policy consultant and professor. Moreover, Dr. Álvarez is author of multiple publications with more than 30 years of academic experience in the areas of institutional reforms, political conflict, comparative public policy, analysis in Latin America. Welcome, Dr. Álvarez. Furthermore, as Francisco mentioned before, for this first part of the workshop, we will have two commentators. The first one is our special guest, Dr. Michelle Bachelet, who is joining the workshop remotely. Dr. Bachelet is the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. Mrs. Bachelet was elected President of Chile on 2 occasions, from 2006 to 2010 and from 2014 to 2018. She was the first female president of Chile. During her presidential tenures, she promoted the rights of all, but particularly those of the most vulnerable. Among her many achievements were education and tax reforms, as well as the creation of the National Institute for Human Rights and the Museum of Memory and Human Rights stand out, as do the establishment of the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality, the adoption of quotas to increase women political participation. Our last but not least important commentator is Dr. Matthew Carnes. He's an associate professor and director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the Georgetown University. He's a Jesuit priest, expert on Latin American studies and social policy. He holds a PhD from Stanford University in political science. He's fluent in Spanish. His research examines the dynamics of labor and social welfare policy in developing and middle-income countries. He has conducted extensive field research in Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Bolivia, and has worked on development projects in Honduras, Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Ecuador. He is the author of Continuity Despite Change, the Politics of Labor Regulation in Latin America. For this part of the workshop, each of our panelists will have between 10 to 15 minutes to present or comment. For that instance, I will show each of them this green card when they have 3 minutes to mention your final remarks. At the end of the presentation, we will open the mic for the public questions. So, Dr. Arriaga, please, you may start. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. It is an honor to greet you all in this opening workshop, previous to our International Association of Jesuit Universities Assembly. I'm so happy to see a lot of people, a lot of friends from all over the world. Thank you for being part of this Jesuit family. I'm very grateful to all of you. I respectfully extend my gratitude to Drs. Michelle Bachelet, Matthew Carnes, thank you, Ángel Álvarez and IAJU regional representatives for accepting our invitation to this dialogue, and of course, all the people that have been involved. I also would like to express my gratitude to Father Christie and Father Garanzini, who were very involved in this process as well. Thank you for all the ongoing support. And of course, President William Leahy from Boston College, which I think is not here, but he will be around. I'm grateful to share with you all the work done by the Association of Jesuit Universities entrusted to the Society of Jesus in Latin America, AUSJAL. But first, I would like to begin by bringing to our memory that just a month ago, 2 Jesuits, Javier Campos and Joaquin Mora, were crudely murdered along with Mr. Pedro Palma inside a church in Cerocahui. Cerocahui is an indigenous area in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. So El Gallo and Morita, as we affectionately call them, gave their lives trying to shelter Mr. Miguel Palma, whose life was being threatened. And our brothers share the fate of the Rarámuri people from over 40 years. They adopted their culture, accompanying and comfort the community as they allowed themselves to be embraced by the community. These deaths are not isolated events in Mexico, but rather an absence of the rule of law. Sadly, many citizens are forgotten, and those living in marginalized areas have been ignored by a state failing to ensure peace and safety. Similarly, three of Ecuador's largest indigenous organizations lead a national strike to demand better living conditions after a year of unsuccessful dialogues with the government. Following 18 days and 8 deaths, the national-wide strike ended thanks to the mediation of the Ecuadorian Conference of Catholic Bishops. A commitment of the government and indigenous organizations to initiate a 90-day dialogue has begun. Jesuit universities have played a relevant role in managing the critical situation previously mentioned, but also a lot of critical situation. In the case of Mexico, we played a vital role in the legal claim for justice through faith, not only for the 2 Jesuits, but for the thousands of people murdered and kidnapped during the last 15 violent years in Mexico. Our calling to lead a national justice and peace movement after the life sacrifice of our brothers has been reinforced and supported by the Mexican Conference of the Catholic Bishops and Pope Francis himself. From its end, the Equatorian Dialogue has a strategic ally in the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador. During the first 18 days of the strike, this university played a double role. First, from the humanitarian perspective, which consisted of the medical and psychological post-care, the management of shelters run by the Jesuit province of Ecuador, and second, a dialogue approach and promotion of such within the 2 interest parties as the only way out of the crisis. So this is how it shows that our universities are always very involved in local context. Unfortunately, these symptoms of the political challenges of our countries face are still in force. I will, in this part, briefly detail the efforts of AUSJAL in the contributions to face such challenges, including the Observatory on Democracy. I will share the interdisciplinary approach that is at the basis of our Observatory of Democracy. And secondly, I will mention some of the primary efforts AUSJAL is currently fostering to strengthen democracy, which is the topic of this workshop. Without doubt, as Father General was saying, COVID-19 and its social consequences led us to question the unequal and ineffective health and welfare systems our society had normalized. Therefore, a complex interdisciplinary approach is the basis of our Observatory of Democracy. AUSJAL Economic Research Network has documented that Latin American poverty reduction advances have been weakly based on primary unsustainable industries and inequality. The economic downbeat since 2014 and the lack of government commitment to warranty social rights have been increased, the discomfort and dissatisfaction of the most of our national populations. Governments are not perceived to act towards people's right or environmental protection, but as warrantors of private stakeholders. Economists such as Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz understand economic crises like ones we faced during the last years as opportunities to refine power relationships in favor of the people. We progressively understand the need for government intervention in markets that otherwise concentrate wealth in a few hands and distribute poverty, which results in human rights deficiency. Thus, poverty diminishes the basis of democracy. That's why we're doing this. In this context, we do not only recognize the current political crisis in Latin America as an apparent rupture with democracy. Authoritarians, leaders, corporate clientelism, and corruption take diverse form in national and also local contexts. In many regions, organized crime expands its territorial dominion for drug trafficking and incorporates other illegal practices such as kidnapping, human trafficking, or forest land exploitation. Furthermore, crime takes over local, provincial, and national authorities, influential the electoral processes, and installing what is commonly known as the narco governments. I mean, narco takes those small communities in several places in Latin America. We have been witness of that phenomenon. However, several signs show possibilities of social transformation. Recently, renovated constitutions demonstrate a will for social change that guarantees citizenship rights. Hundreds of proactive institutions have been created in the last 3 decades in a unique process of democratic innovations. Thousands of mobilizations take place annually to indicate that populations' resilience and desire to make their voice heard. Nevertheless, these efforts are stigmatized, and participants are frequently victims of police and civilian aggressions. To the complexity of these occurrences, AUSJAL is committed to reinforcing its network, research, and advocacy work with an observatory on Latin America democracy. Its creation resulted from a research project agreed upon with Father General and led by Father Jose Virtuoso, which is the president of the Catholic University, Andrés Bello in Caracas, who couldn't join us because he had some problems over there. So Father Virtuoso and Dr. Ángel Álvarez conducted 37 researchers from 22 universities, is that right? Who produced a rich mosaic of studies and proposals for the recognition and recreation of our democracies. The major success was not only publishing a book that was called Crisis and Disappointment with Democracy in Latin America, containing the researchers' proposals, but the creation of an observatory based on this book's conclusions. We must recognize the work of all involved in this process and follow the proposals that they have given in this book. This action originated as a permanent research program on democracy practices that will deepen our approach to the phenomena superficially studied by current regional works. It will give a path, because we have this regional vision, to annual studies and reports on the factors that produce crisis in the region's democracies, the different levels of resilience in each country, based on sample opinions polls. The amount of comparative data and analysis reports for the entire region, including an extraordinary report analysis of cases and relevant events. So this is the idea that we are sharing right now. We have handed you an executive summary of our observatory charter. It details the purpose and also the methodology. I briefly mentioned our initiatives, organization, and the launching budget. The observatory has presently been thought on for Latin America in a Latin American scale. In the second panel of this workshop, we will have the opportunity to discuss the risk that democracy is facing globally and analyze the convenience of amplifying this initiative. Now I would like to share you the areas of advocacy in Latin America. So the green, if you remember, some of the participants here participated in the General Congregation 34. If you remember, there is a degree about Jesuits and university life that describes universities as places where a more universal welfare could be achieved. In this sense, we are called to reinforce our academic programs to contribute to forming social and political leaders committed to constructing a more just, sustainable, and democratic society. In response to this call, our assembly has recently, AUSJAL Assembly, has recently agreed upon 7 priority areas for university advocacy. To guide our work in transforming the Latin American reality, I will not repeat these priority areas since we just listened to Father Sosa's explanation of them. A blue document has been handed out to you detailing our approach to advocacy, which is also a priority in the IAJU, right? The way that we as Jesuit universities can promote public policy in different areas. I will now move forward to mention some of the main actions our association is promoting to pursue advocacy towards justice and reconciliation. First, the implementation of the Regional Diploma in Human Rights, offered in collaboration with the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, from which we count nearly 2,000 graduates. This collaboration with the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights expand on preparing a report and resolution effort that serve as an evaluation of the conditions faced by the indigenous people in the Amazon region and to be better formed agents of change within rural communities who can defend and promote their rights. In addition, we have published a book on the subject of mass media and human rights and several policy briefs with recommendation to face Latin Americans' challenges like inequality, unemployment, and of course, poverty. Lastly, we are investigating the importance of our students' consumption of reliable information. I wish to conclude by emphasizing that this is only one of several relevant advocacy projects AUSJAL is fostering based on our strategic plan. We have a plan that it will be ended in 2025. We have found it especially appropriate since the freedom and equality basis of democracy are still the closest political approach to a human right-based society. Our mission, as has always been emphasized in our general congregations and Father General speeches, to promote justice and reconciliation among people, nations, culture, and spice, and all the people. So I would like to invite you to be witnesses, and remember that always St. Ignatius invite us to examine almost everything, to assess. So it would be good if we can examine how democracy is working in order to fortify it. So thank you very much for this first, and welcome. So happy to see you.
Thank you, Father Luis, for your presentation about Latin American country, emphasizing the role of the new observatory and your final invitation. Now I want to invite Dr. Alvarez to present, and for this you will have 10 minutes, please.
Today, I'm going to present a brief summary of our most recent research on crisis and disenchantment with democracy in Latin America, which the main question is to what extent does democracy work for people? And also, I'm going to present some proposals related to the research agenda and the advocacy agenda of the Observatory for Democracy, which you already know that we are planning to develop. I am very grateful for the opportunity to deliver this presentation to you today. And I had to say that I'm presenting on behalf of a team of 37 scholars from 22 universities in 9 Latin American countries who completed this book that I already have mentioned, and it was completed in 2021, but we haven't stopped working. Actually, as I'm going to mention a few minutes ago, we are continuing with our research in different ways. The research, I have to tell you, was done and published in record time with very limited resources, but with a lot of enthusiasm. The work, as you know, was an initiative of Father General Arturo Sousa and Father Francisco Virtuoso, director of my university, put together this amazing research team, and actually he is the author of the proposal that we developed as researchers. And during the whole process, we counted on the lead and support of Father Luis Arriaga during this research that we did last year. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into the nuances and complexities of the research. I just want to summarize the main findings, but you can find the book is free downloadable from our website at the Catholic University Andrés Bello, and you can read there all the details, methodological research, the details, and the theoretical support and the evidence that we are providing. Summarizing quickly the main findings of our research, I have to say that if we compare what happened at the crest of the democratization that we find in 2001, we can make a contrast what is happening currently. For doing this, we are using the evidence index of electoral democracy. At that particular year, in 2001, was for the first time, until now, for the last time, the only year in which all Latin American countries, with the exception of Cuba, registered a index of electoral democracy equal to or greater than 0.5, which is the middle point. So we didn't have very, very developed democracies, but at least in 2001, we had the whole region with something that we can call electoral democracies. But 20 years later, the number of countries that score over 0.5 has gradually decreased to from 18 to 14 last year. So ostensibly, Latin American democracies are shrinking. Nonetheless, democracy has grown in a few countries, in 5 of them, but just slightly. The setback of democracy has been substantial in Nicaragua and Venezuela, but in the other 11 countries, democracies has grown weaker. The severity of this backsliding stands out even more if we contrast the level of democracy in 2021 with those at the peak of the democratization process 25 years earlier. In 2021, only 4 countries were slightly more democratic than in 2001, and only 3 of them marginally improved their historically low levels of egalitarian democracy. But democracies are not only setting back, but they are also losing popular support. According to Latino Barometer, there are only 2 exceptions to this widespread loss of support for democracy, and they are Chile, and surprisingly, Venezuela. The percentage of citizens who support democracy dropped in 16 countries. In 10 of these 16 countries, the decrease equals 10 or more percentage points. And even more, in 8 countries, in 8 Latin American countries, less than a half of the population prefer democracy to other options. In these 8 cases, which are Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, and Paraguay, in these 8 democracies, the majority is divided between some people who prefer dictatorship and others who are indifferent to democracy and authoritarianism. So there is no doubt that this is a seriously worrying situation. In order to go deep in the analysis of this situation, we run a few statistical tests to explore the relationship between the level of democracy and democratic values. And we found out at least 2 things that I want to stress. First, popular support for democracy does not significantly depend on the existence of and the quality of electoral procedures and formal rights. This is not a surprise, because in Latin America, as you know, this region is full of populist and authoritarian leaders who are elected and re-elected in many countries. So elections have probably become a formality in Latin American countries. But the second finding is even more important. We found out that the preference for democracy is directly correlated with the level of equality, which suggests that Latin American citizens care more about substantive outcomes of democracy than formal democratic procedures. In order to go deeper on this analysis, we are planning to go ahead with a series of analyses that include probably nation-based comparable surveys in each of the Latin American countries included in this study. But before doing that, we are planning to complete a by the end of this year, a study of the support for democracy and the importance of the equalitarian dimension of the democracy, analyzing a sample of social and community leaders. This is going to be a qualitative study, but I think it's going to be the basis for going ahead with a quantitative study next year in order to provide support for not only knowledge, but also for informed socio-political advice and training programs of those groups whose empowerment is a priority. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angel, for sharing with us a summary of the results of this collaborative research. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Bachelet and Dr. Cairns to give and provide feedback of these interesting presentations. In that regard, Dr. Bachelet, can you please comment on the general topic of this workshop and the presentations that you have listened? You will have 15 minutes for that purpose, please, and thank you again for sharing.
Thank you, Jimena, and I want to say a warm hello to all the colleague panelists there. It is my pleasure to join the International Association of Jesuit Universities today, because in these complicated and unpredictable times, discussions such as this among partners like you in the fight for social justice and human rights are ever more vital. But let me start by saying that in 2019, I started following countries because, of course, we discussed situation of human rights all over the world, and we found out that in 80 countries in 2019, so I'm talking before the pandemic, people were on the street demonstrating, and I think there were two things that I could get from that information that I followed. First of all, people were not, as we have heard from all of you, democracy was a system that was not, if I would say, delivering what people expected from democracy. I mean, people felt that democracy would not improve their lives. And as you said, Dr. Alvarez, just the fact of voting for somebody was not enough, and people were also wanted to be part of the decision making, not only to vote and elect somebody. And particularly also, it came with the hands of the lack of, if I would say, lack of confidence and trust in institutions, in political institutions, in judicial system, et cetera, et cetera. And the second thing that were hand by hand on that was the perspective that the economic system, global system, was also not providing, was increasing the gaps in between the poorest and the richest, and was not providing the minimal basic standards. And I will talk a little bit afterwards about that as well. So when we go now and we see at the glance of the state of the world today, the truth is that reveals a grim picture. Just as we have heard, when we were thought that we were slowly emerging from a global health pandemic, the armed attack in Ukraine and its socioeconomic consequences globally have thrown us deeper into turbulence. A global food, fuel, and finance crisis risks plunging millions into food insecurity and poverty. 1.2 billion people live in countries that are severely exposed and vulnerable to all three dimensions of finance, food, and energy simultaneously. And the region doesn't differ on that. We have seen increase of inflation, increase of a lot of food prices, fertilizer prices, gas prices. So we will have, I mean, when we thought we could be able maybe to recover from the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, now we have all these other as well. And we know that what COVID-19 did was let bare the inequalities in our society that were there from much before. And inequalities between and within countries are skyrocketing, threatening COVID-19 recoveries, undermining progress in the implementation of the SDGs, and slowing down climate action. And also we see polarization that both within and between countries continues to grow, the weakening of multilateralism, of the international legal order, and of international law itself, with immense consequences on human rights. Democracy too is ailing, as we have heard. As you mentioned, I have global numbers here, not necessarily the regional numbers, but in 2021, as you mentioned, the level of democracy enjoyed globally by the average person was down to 1989 levels. This means that democratic gains of the last 30 years have been greatly reduced. Last year, almost a third of the global population lived under authoritarian rule. And the number of countries leaning to authoritarianism is 3 times that of those leaning to democracy. And as you mentioned, the democratic decline is especially evident in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Asia Pacific, but also in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean through various attacks on the rule of law. For instance, in some countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, we have observed attacks on electoral management bodies, on constitutional courts, the media, and national human rights institutions, and the use by governments of COVID-19 as an excuse to reduce oversight of public administration. And of course, the region is one of the ones where more human rights defenders are killed, as Father Arriaga was mentioning as well, of the people of the Jesuit church that were killed in Chihuahua. And then trust in institution is fading. People feel ignored, like democracy has not fully delivered its promise. Growing inequalities as women, minorities, older persons, and all other people have been traditionally marginalized are left further behind. And these exclusions feed the distrust and cynicism in institutions, and also lack of transparency in public decision-making or accountability of government or public officials is further eroding people's trust. For many, limited civic education and an absence of viable political candidates in particular, with whom young people identify with, compound their feelings of alienation. Disinformation is used as a tool for autocratic governments to shape domestic and international opinion, at times reaching toxic levels. It fuels hate speech against the marginalized and excluded, and undermines our shared humanity. Lack of trust in institutions have provided fertile ground for populist leaders, as you mentioned before, and movements that take the opportunity to pin all blame on democracy and human rights, thus chip away at human rights one right at a time. Some established democracies have then taken a page from the authoritarian playbook, thinking it is the only way to salvage support. They impose restrictions on civil society, on civic space, on free expression, on media freedom, and other rights that are essential for the democracy. So a veritable race to the bottom. And yet, I'm also here to share some positive news with you, because democracy is resilient. The democratic ideal persists, with a recent study showing widespread approval for representative democracy, even though I heard very clearly what Dr. Alvaro was mentioning in terms of how some people felt, but I think it's related to the lack of, to the importance that people does give to political systems and economic systems that should deliver for them, and they're not doing that. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, democratic practices adopted in innovative ways. Some countries managed to hold elections in exceedingly difficult conditions, for instance, by expanding absentee voting mechanisms or early voting procedures. In addition, social movements for tackling climate change and fighting racial inequalities grew globally. People turned out to make their voices heard, even amidst pandemic restrictions. This shows people want their voices heard, demanding economic and social systems that work for everybody, and to have a say in the decisions that affect their life, as we were talking before. So these protests are an expression of human rights and democratic values, and as such, they must be respected and facilitated by government. They should not be perceived as a threat. On the contrary, enabling spaces where public participation are one of the most effective ways for authority to understand people's grievances and make better informed decisions. Hear your voice in academic sphere, and I think all the researchers you've been talking about, and I think the establishment of an observatory is a fantastic one, and I hope we will continue to provide information that can permit to strengthen the democracy, the rule of law, and of course, people's participation as well. And I think the possibility that you, in your academic sphere, fight for the expansion of spaces for people to participate in all the diversity is crucial. And also the idea of training future leaders in the region, I think is a great one, because training, mentoring people that can really play a substantive role is essential. That question of how to transform participation so that it works for people at all levels, from local to global, is a key question of the future. In his report, Our Common Agenda of the UN Secretary General, if you have not read it, I will recommend it to read it because it's a really interesting report, has recognized this challenge, calling for new initiatives to improve the way of listening to people from whom states and international institutions such as the UN are meant to serve. Demands for human rights and equality, less corruption, concrete action on climate change will continue, and rightly so, as there are things that true democracies can and must deliver. Colleagues, friends, precisely at this moment of uncertainty and unpredictability, we must remain steadfast in our commitment to democracy and human rights. In our common agenda, the UN Secretary General called for a new social contract to restore public trust and forge a stronger compact between governments, people, civil society, business, and more, based on equal rights and opportunities for all. To address the gap between people's expectation and what governments can deliver, a new social contract is needed, based on inclusive deliberations in society. Addressing inequalities, fighting corruption, and tackling climate change need to be at the core of the conversations. Social spending is also critical for promoting equality and strengthening democracy. If national budgets integrate states' human rights obligations and allocate sufficient resources to cover at least minimal essential levels of economic and social rights for all, they can be a powerful lever for equality. National spending in social sector that focuses on accessibility, affordability, and quality of services, as well as non-discrimination, including based on gender, strengthens livelihoods and erodes inequality. Increasing such spending keeps more children in school and protects and raises the health and overall standard of living of the population. So this is society's most effective tool to build resilience. This approach, which is grounded in human rights principles, helps build respect for the social contract and reinforces the tenets of democracy. In addition, democratic institutions need to be strengthened, from electoral commission to high courts, from local governments to national human rights institutions, from media boards to anti-corruption entities, that this democratic structure need to be reinforced, including by increasing transparency and independence so they deliver to the people and the trust institution is restored. Independent, rule of law abiding institutions play a key role in ensuring the necessary checks and balances. They provide the ultimate foundation for stronger and resilient democracies. So to prevent democratic backsliding, political and financial support is critical to promote public participation, media freedom, and civic education. Prioritizing investment in these pillars of democracy and promoting them in political action will go a long way in addressing some of these issues the world is currently and the region is currently faces. So in line with the international human rights obligation, governments need to protect and promote the space for people to engage in public affairs, to voice their views and concerns freely, safely, and without fear, including through peaceful protest and other forms of civic engagement. But also government has a responsibility to promote and protect the freedom of expression, including media freedom, essential tool to tackle disinformation, polarization, and hate speech. So yes, we're living in challenging time, but my experience has shown me that there will always be obstacles. People who in the name of power will put spokes on the wheels of democracy, of justice and equality. And these days their voices are growing louder. But that's why our concerted, principled efforts are vital, to come together by looking to build and advance, to fight for our common humanity, human rights, and to persevere in our commitment to democracy in the name of dignity and equality for all. The Jesuits, including their academic institution, have been a force for good in striving for social equality. I know that you will continue playing a crucial role in addressing these challenges. So let's hope we can continue espousing the human rights roadmap to do so. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bachelet, for your insights about this complex society where our engagement and response is necessarily from our different roles. Well, Dr. Kearns, you as an expert on Latin America, and considering what you have heard and listened today, please can you share your comments? You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's always a challenge to follow someone with as comprehensive a vision as Dr. Bachelet and the contribution she's made to our globe. So it's a real privilege. Thank you for letting me share this opportunity with you. I'm also really grateful for the discussion we're having and for this project. Father Francisco Virtuoso, who's been sort of the spearhead on this, and then Angel working with these researchers from 22 universities, 9 countries in Latin America, they've been able to do something incredibly important here. which is to bore down deep into the recent challenges to democracy that are particular to Latin America, but not particular to Latin America. In fact, they certainly are shared across the Americas, including the country in which we find ourselves now, and really across our globe today, and we need to think about them deeply. One thing I appreciate about this study is it bores down and looks at the particular experience of each varied country within Latin America. And those of you who know the region know that the countries are incredibly different. And some are seeing resurgences of democracy, even as others are seeing incredible backsliding. And this is traced out in really intricate ways in the data that Dr. Alvarez summarized. It's also an example of what collaboration can look like when we bring together the Jesuit network. So when we're not doing this as isolated researchers, isolated universities, but actually dialogue with one another, learning from the questions, learning from the experiences, and then thinking collectively about how can we make a difference in the future? How can we be agents of restoring a kind of trust in democracy, of an involvement in democracy, and in a participation in democracy that can allow it to flourish more in the future? So this is a really model piece of work. Now, I've had the chance to actually read the report. I was fortunate enough to receive it in our Center for Latin American Studies a few months back. And I spent a long time going through its various sections. And I want to highlight one main idea and then offer a few general thoughts for us as we think about democracy around the globe. The piece I want to highlight most from the report, and it's something that Dr. Alvarez summarized, it's also something that Dr. Bachelet has highlighted very, very well. It's this word that's part of the title. So it's a crisis y desencanto in la democracia, desencanto, this disenchantment, this disappointment with democracy. And what this means is throughout the region, there has been a growing mistrust or distrust or disappointment with what democracy is currently delivering, as Dr. Bachelet said so well. And it's not that distrust is simply based on democratic institutions, the ways that elections are held, although those matter a lot, but it has something to do with the basic social bargain that democracy is delivering. Often economic outcomes, often the sense of polarization and inequality in outcomes and in opportunities throughout society. As many of you know, Latin America is the region that has been most unequal for the last several hundred years of our world's history, the biggest divisions across rich and poor, and it hasn't shrunk much. There have been a few years where it declined a tiny bit, but for the most part, that hasn't shrunk much. And that division leads people to feel more and more left out. Feel like even if I play this game the way it's supposed to be played, even if I have this opportunity to vote like anyone else, it's not improving the outcomes that I experience on a daily basis. And that leads to a distrust. It leads to a worry about what can my future look like. Now, this is summarized in a number of different outcomes in the report, and I'll just name a few of them. Ideological polarization, as people start to feel like this is a winner-take-all battle that's unequal. In presidential crises, who can this president be the be-all and end-all for us? Often a messianism in terms of presidential candidates saying, I will be the one to fix this. I'm the only one that can do it. Corruption, where those that have and have access are able to grab more and more for themselves, increasing the distrust of others. A growing personalism in politics that's very much driven by this candidate and her name or his name, rather than a sense of a shared political party vision or a shared social mission across all. Growing populism in the region, as I've just mentioned, and in some cases, restrictions on political rights, on civil liberties, especially by those in power. And as Father Aliaga highlighted so well at the beginning, also a real crisis in the rule of law, a growing sense that some parts of some of these countries are ungovernable or don't have a sense of security and a sense of rule of law from the state. And this leads to even greater distrust. So as I say, this model, this constellation of democratic institutions and efforts has not resulted in a sense that people feel like I have more of a future here. Like I can trust that if I play this game well, it will deliver in the future. So this is so well diagnosed in the report. And it's left me with several reflections I'd like to share, 4 general reflections on democracy, the quality of democracy, and maybe just a tiny bit on what we might do about that. So first of all, I want to make an obvious point, but one that is increasingly obvious, and it's this. There's nothing inevitable about democracy. There is nothing, to use the Greek term, teleological about democracy. It doesn't have an inner dynamism that is going to happen or must happen. And in fact, it's really hard work, and it can go off the rails in a lot of different ways. Now, I say that's an obvious point, but actually it wasn't one to most of us, and I'm looking around the room at the age of people who are here, of a certain age, because many of us came of age during a period after the Second World War. In fact, really were formed after the end of the Cold War. And after the end of the Cold War, there was this, as you'll remember, summarized so well in that Fukuyama vision, this end of history moment, this moment that now it was all but inevitable, that once societies were set free, they would just become more democratic. And people would find ways of working out differences, and this would mean that voices that were never included before would get included. It would mean that there would be more equitable growth, and we would just be moving forward. We thought that this would actually be, somewhat naively, pretty easy. What we've seen in recent years is that's not the case at all. In fact, there can be elements of democracy that lead to the undermining of democracy. Control by strong presidents, the ability to control legislatures or dismiss legislatures, the ability to appoint judges or dismiss judges. These can lead to outcomes that are highly undemocratic and highly not inclusive. We can see many ways in which people can become disenchanted, as we've just been talking about with democracy. So democracy in itself is not easy, and we shouldn't take it as that. We shouldn't expect it as that. And maybe Latin America experienced this in a particular way, given its transitions from authoritarian rule in many countries to democracy. And so many felt like they'd just been set free, and this would just keep moving forward. But we see the ability to deliver hasn't always paid out. That's point one. Democracy isn't easy, nor is it inevitable. Point two is that institutions matter, but they're not a guarantee unto themselves. So institutions like constitutions, like voting rules, like the protection of rights of the press, like courts, all of these matter tremendously. They can be incredible protections and checks on the balance of power of those who are in charge. But they can also get ossified. They can also set up expectations that can be impossible to fulfill. They can be institutions that start to actually sow the seeds of their own destruction. On the one hand, they can mean that some have disproportionate power. And on the other hand, there can be a temptation then, and this is a very interesting moment to think about this right now. Thinking of the case of Chile, and those of you who've been following Chile, it is a fascinating time. Dr. Bachelet mentioned in 2019 the massive mobilizations that followed on previous mobilizations in years prior to that, but the massive mobilizations that resulted in that country saying, our institutions are insufficient. The constitution that we have right now is insufficient to the moment. And so they had a popular referendum that won overwhelmingly to rewrite the Constitution. But now there is this difficult task of writing the best possible democratic constitution, and to do it on a timeline. Initially they had 9 months, now they have a little bit longer to finish it up. Soon it will go up for a popular referendum, a democratic referendum. And there is the danger that as they try to go about this incredible effort to create a constitution that will better meet the needs of today, not 1980 like the previous constitution, there's the temptation to try to cram every last thing in there and make every promise to every group. And this can lead some people to feel like, well, my group either didn't get fully included, or I'm not sure how that's going to play out, or just have doubts about the possibility of carrying off such a massive reform. And in fact, right now, we're looking at a very tenuous moment in Chile, where the current polls show this new constitution possibly losing. And if it does, what sort of discontent will we see then? And will be tied back to the old institutions that we had before that everyone recognizes are insufficient. So again, my point, institutions matter, but they aren't guarantees. And institutions aren't easy to get right. To get the right electoral institutions, to get the right kind of participation, we don't have a full vision of what this means. Third, and this is one that's already been emphasized, so I won't belabor it, but just to say that democracy, like all forms of government, is only as successful as its ability to deliver on all the other things that people want in good lives. So democracy must, like any other government, deliver the kinds of economic possibilities that people want. It needs to deliver the kinds of social inclusion that people want, the opportunities for social mobility that people want. And when it doesn't, people hold not just the current government accountable, not just the economic system accountable, but the political system as well. And those troubling statistics that Dr. Alvarez cited, which we've seen for many years too in the Latino Barometro data, showing the great mistrust of democracy and sometimes the preference for autocracy in Latin America, because the promise that autocracy might be able to deliver more quickly than democracy can. So democracy needs to deliver, and wow, it's struggled like any other kind of government during the pandemic, during the slowdown in growth in recent months, during the responses to the Ukraine war. It's facing the same challenges that any other government has, but democracies are held accountable in a way that it's much harder to hold autocrats accountable. And then finally, and this might be my most important point, it strikes me that we are really facing a generational challenge in democracy. I was very struck by Dr. Alvarez's point that 2001 was an inflection point. 2001 was this inflection point where democracy in the number of countries that counted as marginally democratic in Latin America began to decrease. Now, if you think about it today, young people today, in fact, almost all of the students in our universities around the globe were born or came of age after 2001. They have known only one kind of democracy. It's democracy on the decline. It's democracy under question. It's democracy not performing well. It's backsliding on democracy. And so if our generation, many of us in this room who are older, came of age thinking that democracy was inevitable, they're coming of age thinking democracy is deeply, deeply flawed, and that democracy can't deliver, that democracy often will be under siege. And that, to me, is the real challenge. That's the disappointment, the desencanto, that we need to address. Because when you're distrusting the system, when you think this democracy is set up against you, well, then it starts to mean that you distrust everybody else. You distrust other citizens. You know, are they trying to get more out of this than I am? It starts to create a winner-take-all mentality. So if my side wins this election, we are going to just use the government for ourselves because we don't know if we'll have it the next time. And if the other side wins, they're going to throw out everything we did and they're going to take it for themselves. This winner-take-all mentality becomes stronger and stronger. This polarization can start to happen. You're either with me or you're against me. And it can very much lead to a sense that we're not sharing any sort of common vision, common project as a country. It's each of us for ourselves. See, this undermines the basic social contract of democracy, as Dr. Bachelet said. This social contract in which we say that if we work together, we can do more. Rather, instead, we see a kind of democracy in which everyone feels like together we're threatened, so better do less together. That's extremely problematic. Now, some of my colleagues at Harvard University have recently written about how democracies fail. And if you haven't read the book by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, it's worth your time. And they end with a very important point. They say one element that we've lost in democracy in many countries is a kind of trust and a kind of forbearance with one another. Because democracy demands on the fact that I trust the other that if they win, they won't use the government completely against me, and the trust that if I win, I will have the forbearance not to use the government completely against them. We will compromise over and over again, trusting that the system of voting in and out, different candidates, different parties, will allow us together, somewhat haltingly, but somewhat together, move forward in a constructive, collective way. That idea is something that's been fundamentally lost in this moment of desencanto, of this moment of distrust of democracy. So it strikes me then that we have a bit of a mission before us, but it's one that we are particularly well suited for. And I say that because, well, first of all, at the broad level, religious institutions like ours, like the Society of Jesus, like the universities we have, these are dedicated to the idea of bringing diverse people together under a common vision of a God who loves us first, who values the dignity of each of us first, who stands by us over the long haul, who gives us hope. And we as Jesuit institutions have a sense of the ways that we can create spaces. I always go back to a phrase from the 34th General Congregation. They spoke about the way that the Society of Jesus is called to form communities of solidarity, communities that draw people together at the local level, at the global level, to feel that fellow feeling that we are in this together. It's not winner take all, we're in this together. And together we can habituate and cultivate those practices of listening, of collaborating, of trusting one another, of sometimes having discussions where one of us wins and the other loses, but we stay in the conversation, and we can learn from each other, and we can grow, and we can try out and experiment. Strikes me that these communities of solidarity are what our universities are called to be. And it strikes me too that our universal apostolic preferences are well poised to start to address some of this crisis of democracy. First of all, I love that phrase in that, I believe it's the fourth of the UAPs, the idea of journeying with youth toward a hope-filled future. Maybe that's the third, but one of the 4 UAPs. This idea of journeying with youth towards a hope-filled future. If there's one thing that's lacking in our democratic moment right now, it's that lack of trust. So how do we move people to have greater trust in one another? I think it's when we bring them to our campuses and they have shared missions and shared opportunities together. I think it's when we work with them to become the leaders that can shape policies that are inclusive and bring in all. I think it's when we help them dream of a world in which this doesn't need to be winner take all, but more and more they can see opportunities for shared growth and shared opportunity. So 4 observations and a bit of an idea about how we might start to contribute to this. I look forward to the rest of the conversation, and I'm really delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kearns, for your presentation and your approach on distrust of the democracy and how we can work on changing on that. Well, because of time, we only will have a couple of minutes for questions. So the mics are open, so we invite you to make some questions for our panelists. Please, we have 2 mics over there.
Over there, behind you.
One question.
Anyone, please? Okay, someone is coming. So let us know, who are you addressing the question, please?
Hello, I would like to address the question to Francisco, who wasn't really a panelist. First of all, thank you for this conversation. It's been really terrific. And my question to you, Francisco, about developing this observatory, it's really inspiring because you've carried through the whole idea of collaboration and leveraging all the assets that we have as Jesuit universities around the world. And I see in this report how you've developed the specific questions that you're addressing, the objectives, with your researchers in all these 22 countries. What I'm thinking about is, when we get all of this research and all of this information, is there a way that then we can inform partner institutions, like, certain divisions within the United Nations or non-government organizations that are working on the ground on these problems, or even our own Jesuit social centers, kind of move the collaboration even further so that we are working on the solutions by partnering with other organizations. We're designed as universities to conduct research and to teach and transform students. But maybe our research can then be implemented if we further the collaboration with other organizations. Thank you.
A second question, please, and then we will answer all of them, please.
Thank you. Paul Fitzgerald from the University of San Francisco. And especially Dr. Carnes, Father Carnes, your last point, I think challenges all of us. And so it's a question for the whole panel. But okay, when Alexis de Tocqueville visited a very young United States of America, he saw a republic built on slavery, the annihilation of the indigenous people, all kinds of violations of human rights. But also he saw strength. And the great strength that he saw was our ability to form local associations, school boards, water districts, bowling clubs, all those things that allowed us to practice democracy on a very local level. That has almost completely disappeared in the United States. People, they're on their devices, and social media has really destroyed much of that ability for us to form compromising, respectful associations of solidarity. Roger McNamee, in his recent book, We Are So Zucked, is worth reading, about how Facebook and Google manipulate us, take all our data for their financial gain. How can we as Jesuit universities school our students in kind of, again, forming associations of solidarity, respect, diversity, equity, and inclusion based on an Ignatian worldview?
Before giving the word to Dr. Kearns, I want to thank you, Dr. Bachelet, for joining us today to the panel. I know that you have to leave the workshop, so thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
I will briefly answer Dr. Nancy Truman's. First, I'm very grateful for her positive feedback to the observatory and cannot take credit for it since it has been led by Father Francisco Virtuoso from Andrés Bello Catholic University, along with Dr. Angel Alvarez and more than 30 researchers working on it with the support of all 30 AUSJAL universities. Secondly, of course, we're working, and this is part of the work of delivering the findings of this observatory and conspiring with all of you in order to build a worldwide alliance in favor of the re-enchantment and the reopening of possibilities on the basis of democracy. We also have Dr. Cristobal Bonefoy from the Inter-American Development Bank listening to this presentation and interested, as well as other foundations interested in supporting this observatory. We will be thankful for any alliance coming from your universities and your national and international allies as well. We'll be listening to global efforts in the second part of this panel, and also listen to Dr. Alvarez and Dr. Arriaga's final thoughts in a second. Thank you. Dr. Carnes?
Thank you, Father Fitzgerald, for the very good question. And I, two thoughts. More and more I say to my students when they graduate, the most important decision they will make when they graduate is not what job they'll take, but where they will physically live. And actually say that at the micro level. So not what city you're going to live in, what neighborhood you're going to live in. Because the neighborhood you live in shapes your imagination. It shapes your experience of what it's like to be a citizen. And you can choose, and actually many of our students with the mobility that they gain from being in our institutions can go to very comfortable parts of cities. And we know cities have become very segregated, especially in the United States, but in many countries. But the choice to be in a community that is more mixed, that has mobility going on in it, or even one that's underserved and underprivileged, can be one that actually is life transforming, because it really shapes your sense of what's having enough? What's it look like to spend a weekend? What's a valuable time spent with family or friends? Or is it going to some restaurant or some destination, or is it actually time shared in a home? So I think that's the most fundamental question. And I think if we can form people to ask that question, that will help. And just to point out a way we do that, maybe on our campuses, is trying to create campus experiences that mirror that. And so one I can think of here in the United States is something like the Arupe College experience at Loyola Chicago. That's this important bridge for students that might not go to a Jesuit university, who have this experience of mixing with, and then our students have the experience of mixing with a more diverse community that then can be something of a bridge. Or to point back to Latin America, since this is a panel brought to us by Latin America, the Universidad Antonio Ruiz de Montoya in Lima, Peru. The Jesuits in Peru figured out that, most of the university students in Lima were coming from pretty privileged families, and they weren't coming from the countryside, they weren't coming from the rural villages, from the highlands. So they designed the Ruiz de Montoya to be a university where Quechua and Aymara are allowed to be spoken, where this is a space where we really try to engage across groups. That sort of rubbing shoulders, I think, might be a first step towards, this sort of local experience of shared citizenship and democracy. But it's a huge challenge. I think you're exactly right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kearns. Dr. Arriaga, some final thoughts to close our panel, please.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that we have right now the possibility to build bridges between different peoples, to build bridges between business people, government, all kind of people. As Jesuit University, we have the capacity to influence in making public policy in our universities. Secondly, I think we have the strong possibility here to make a stronger network here. So this is not only a couple of talks that we will have. This is a possibility to build bridges between us and build projects together in those big topics that we have in the world. And of course, to share good practices. I mean, one of the most important things that I have learned in this kind of meetings, or when I was in the social center in Latin America, is how can we share good practices, and how can we say, well, I'm good on this field, can you help me? So please enjoy this whole meeting and keep going. We're looking forward for Linda's panels. Thank you for coming, Linda.
Thank you very much. So this has been the first part of the workshop. We have a coffee break for you, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, experts.
Okay, we'll introduce Father Francois Caboret at the end, so that now we can begin now. Whenever you... begin.
see him? We can't start without you.
Oh, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. We have a house announcement. We have a passport from Alejandra Davila Varillas. Is she here? Oh, hi. Alejandra, el pasaporte tuyo está en Stayer Hall, en el Welcome Center. Para cuando salgas lo puedes reclamar ahí. Thank you.
Second announcement for the people who just came in. We have a brochure on the Observatorio on democracy we're discussing. You can pick it up when you leave. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to have you all here in person. If I could, I'd go around and hug every single one of you. This is part 2 of contributions to face the crisis of fragility of democracy around the world. Congratulations to the members of the panel that went first. That was absolutely fantastic. And if you will permit me, I'd like to summarize some of the salient points from that panel, and then we'll go into an introduction of our panelists and proceed with the program. Here's what we heard from our first panelists. We heard that there is a backsliding of democratic values, and that the list of divisive issues around the globe is long and complex, with political leaders more polarized and less able to compromise than ever before. Democracy is indeed in a fragile state. We see less participation of our citizens, which gives rise to the extremes, with individuals more open to populist leaders. There are also structural reasons to explain fading democratic values around the world. A few examples: the stagnation of living standards for middle and working class individuals, the rise of social media, which can pull parties and issues to the extremes, thereby resulting in ideological polarization. We also heard that there is a lack of trust in institutions that once enjoyed immense respect as arbiters of truth, justice, and peace. We are working very hard to build diverse democracies that treat members as equals. There is so much more to do. We must work together to counter the prevailing narrative that demography is destiny. We must also learn to manage the propensity for individuals to find comfort only in select groups. We need to teach our students in a way that inspires cooperation and friendship rather than hatred, resentment, and violence. And finally, we need to build spaces out of our own identity expression. In our case, members of the global Jesuit order. And then with those identity expressions, connect to other identities, and then have a stake in their thriving. At this moment, we need to collaborate intensely to bridge divides. And with that, I'll introduce our panelists. Professor Carla Ede, Vice President for International Affairs, St. Joseph's University. Welcome. Thomas Bancha, Vice President for Global Engagement and Director of the Berkeley Center for Affairs at Georgetown University. Welcome, Tom. Immediately to my right, Joy James, Secretary for the Jesuit Higher Education Association, South Asia. Sofia Opatska, Vice Rector for Strategic Planning at the Ukrainian Catholic University. Welcome. Francois Cabaret, President of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities in Africa and Madagascar. Welcome, Francois. And Johannes Priatma, Chairperson of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities in the Asia Pacific. Fantastic. So we will begin with Carla Ede. Each speaker will have 10 minutes. We're going to hold them to it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to extend my thanks to Father Garantini, who made it possible. I would like also to thank Boston College and Father Leahy and his team and International Association of Jesuit University for the wonderful organizational work and the warm welcome. So I'm from Lebanon, from St. Joseph University of Beirut. Since I was a child, I hear the following statement. Lebanon is going through one of the most critical phases of its history for the time being. This is one of the reasons I chose to study history. Why is Lebanon such an unstable country? The obvious answer is because it has 20 different religious groups officially recognized. Well, of course, that makes it a plural society and a very divided one. Of course, another reason, we live in a region where wars and conflicts have been recurrent since World War I. But yet, this is not enough to understand why Lebanon is such a fragile country. The answer, the easiest one, but I think the most convincing one, is because it's a democracy, and it's a weird democracy. So yes, it is a democracy. Constitutions are not enough to guarantee human rights, but freedom of religion, of conscience, of faith, freedom of expression and opinion and association are inscribed in our constitution. We have political freedom for organizing political activities, political parties, for running for elections, and so on and so forth. We have also a pluralistic media and other components essential for a democracy. Yet, on the other side, we have also violence as a means to achieve political goals. Political assassination of political figures, of reporters, of civil society activists, again, are very common. And violence against pacific demonstrations that occurred 2 years ago also are really frequent and happen quite often. And justice is not here, and impunity is part of our system. So this is why the situation we are facing on a daily basis at my university in Beirut. So what do we do about it? How does USJ promote democracy and human rights? We try, of course, to do it in the 3 dimensions of our mission: teaching, research, and service to society. I will give but few examples in order not to be too long, and of course, I'll be very happy to elaborate if there are questions. So there is a compulsory 12 credits for all our undergraduate students, which are composed of courses about citizenship and human rights, ethics, interreligious dialogue, and the other is about general culture. This is mandatory for all our students. Since 2017, we are the coordinator of the Arab Master of Human Rights and Democracy. It's the first time this master was implemented in the Arab region and Arab world. It's part of the Global Campus of Human Rights, which is funded by the EU. And we launched also the first professional mediation center in Lebanon and the Middle East. And it offers training for people, of course, out of the university, but also for staff and students. And again, it's compulsory for all the candidates who want to run for the student body elections. So this is part of the teaching arena. For the research, one of the longest war in the Lebanese history is the civil war of 1975-1990. We started documenting the war during the war, and this was, of course, a dangerous task to do. So we continued, and we were the first one to publish about displaced people in the whole country during the war. We continued that effort after the war, and we were the scientific partners of the International Center for Transitional Justice when it comes to the mapping of massive violence and violation of human rights in Lebanon since 1975 until 2008. On another level, we launched the Observatory of the Children and Youth Protection and Rights. So again, they are very dynamic, and they publish research, and they were instrumental in doing or writing new procedures, standard procedures for the children protection, especially in the refugee camps. So we've done that project with UNICEF and with the Ministry of Labor in Lebanon, who asked for our expertise. So this is again research and expertise and service to society. When it comes to service to society, other activities have been implemented. We are specialists of TOT, training of trainers, for NGOs, local NGOs and their staff, again in the camps, Palestinian and Syrian refugee camps, but also in the civil society domains and the civil rights. We also are training a public servant from the administrative and military administration, especially in the areas, remote area of the country where extremism is on the rise. And another example about our legal clinic. Of course, it's service learning for our students from our law school, but they have been also very proactive after the Beirut blast. Tomorrow is the 2nd anniversary of the Beirut blast, and they helped the victims. So we received hundreds of victims to help them to try to obtain their rights. So these are but few examples. Endowed with our belief in the Emmanuel, we shall continue to promote cultural resistance and human rights, because we still think that Lebanon is yet a necessity in the Middle East, even if it's such a weird democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. I would now like to invite Tom Banshaw to the podium, please.
This is such a friendly and warm crowd. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Linda, for moderating the panel. I also want to thank Francisco for organizing the first panel we had, and by extension recognize the remarkable work of AUSJAL within our global network, and really emphasizing the social justice and the political engagement dimensions of our mission, and being a regional model for our global efforts. So, crisis and fragility of democracy. I'm at Georgetown, I'm an American citizen, we're here in the US, so I thought I'd say a little bit about the situation in this country here from my point of view, but place it in a wider global context, and then really zero in on one of the themes of our panel, which is how can we as Jesuit institutions in our educational mission make a positive difference. All right, first, crisis of democracy in the United States. Just 5 quick, unoriginal observations. First, we have a former president who still refuses to accept the legitimacy of the last election and who has encouraged the storming of the US Capitol. I could stop there, but I'll go on to point number 2. We see a deeply flawed electoral system fueled by cash injections that privileges personalities and personal attacks over thoughtful debate. Third, the deeply polarized parties within this flawed electoral system are unable to find common ground on issues ranging from economic policy to social, environmental, and racial justice. Fourth, dysfunctional elections and parties are in turn embedded within a sharply unequal society and a public sphere dominated by a sensationalist press and unaccountable social media. And fifth, and I could go on, I could use both hands. Fifth, we have a public that is fully aware of these trenchant problems and is expressing historically low levels of confidence in our democratic institutions. So there is a crisis that's plain for all to see. How serious is it? Well, in a hopeful mode, I want to suggest that it's extremely serious, but not existential. And of course, we could have a whole seminar about this. But I would note that US democratic institutions have weathered major crises before. Think of the Watergate scandal just 50 years ago, a president's criminal and failed attempt to stay in power at all costs. Money and personalities have always, I would argue, played an outsized role in US elections. Partisan polarization is nothing new. Deep social inequality has been a historical constant in the United States. And if you look at structural racial inequality, for example, in this country, has been much worse in earlier eras, still a huge problem, but has been worse. Social media is, of course, new, but sensationalist media is not. So I'm suggesting here that whether we look at the upheavals of the late 60s and early 70s, the Depression decade of the 30s, for example, or the post-Civil War decades of the late 19th century, crises of democracy in the United States have precedence. Well, there are many alarming things about this particular crisis. One thing that's particularly alarming, I think, given our identity and where we're coming from here at this assembly, is that from the perspective of Catholic social thought, the principle of the common good, which has actually been upheld historically, at least at a rhetorical level across parties in the United States, it's part of the Republican with a small r tradition in US political culture. The decay of the principle of the common good is a real concern. It's lost its foothold in our public discourse. It's finding less and less resonance as partisans of the left and the right express their trenchant criticism and cynicism about the possibility or even the value of finding common ground, and I find that very disturbing. All right, what is to be done? Where do we go from here? What's the role of Jesuit institutions in the United States and in so-called established and long-standing democracies in face of the crisis that I've described, which I think exists in various symptomatic forms in other long-established democracies around the world? Here, I think a point of departure is that historically, our record as Jesuit universities in the United States has not been stellar. Up through the middle of the 20th century, Jesuit universities, now 28 in number, were, I would argue, closely aligned with and supportive of US democracy and its flawed institutions, often in a conservative spirit. This patriotic stance was partly the caution of a minority in a Protestant majority country. Jesuit institutions have long served as vehicles for social advancement for waves of migrants, especially from Europe and Latin America, that swelled the Catholic population from just 1% at the founding of the United States to its current 20% plus. The patriotic and conservative thrust of Jesuit education signaled loyalty to democracy at a time when the global church as a whole had not yet embraced, or certainly not fully embraced, democratic norms. I think I have a minute here just to draw a parallel with the career of John F. Kennedy, who, in fighting an uphill battle to become the country's first Catholic president, interesting to remember, Biden's only the second Catholic president. Biden was the first Catholic vice president in US history. In fighting that uphill battle, JFK emphasized that he was not, quote, a Catholic candidate, but rather, quote, a candidate for president who happens also to be a Catholic, unquote. And such cautious political logic in the search for respectability, I want to suggest, has also been at play in the sort of psychological ethos of Jesuit institutions, at least through the middle of the last century, helps to explain why we have not been leading spaces really for prophetic gospel critiques of the shortcomings of US democracy throughout our history. Fortunately, of course, things have changed since Vatican II, since the Church's embrace of democracy, the reinvigoration of Catholic social thought, and the new path charted by the Society of Jesus since Father Pedro Rupe and under his successors. But there's still much to be done. And a lot, as we know, we're all here sharing our experiences, a lot is being done today in the era of Pope Francis, in light of, in the context of all the global problems we'll be discussing, including the crisis of democracy. It's been striking to see over the past several years our universities in the United States, and I think it's mirrored around the world, staking out clear public positions in support, for example, of migrants and refugees, against racism, and in support of environmental justice. And we'll be discussing these ongoing efforts in the coming days. We're also, I think, all collectively in a process of reflection about how to explore creative new ways to embed the promotion of justice in our core educational mission, the formation of citizens and leaders as agents of change. Remember Father Kolvenbach's famous phrase, reminding us that the measure of our universities is who our students become. In that context, and here I'm coming to my conclusion, I think the theme of education for global citizenship, which we'll be discussing more tomorrow, is increasingly important. For today's crisis of democracy is also marked by an ugly upsurge of nationalism in the United States and around the world. And one of our, I hate to say assets, but one of our blessings as Jesuit institutions is that we're really part of the centuries-old international tradition with a global horizon. And given the magnitude of global challenges we face, from climate change and social inequality to global health, peace, and security, I think you'll agree we've got to find creative ways to leverage our network to educate our students for citizenship and leadership in a divided world. What Father Sosa at the Bilbao Assembly called, quote, university education aimed at universal citizenship. So we have to find creative ways to educate our students in this new context for citizenship. At the same time, I believe we have to find equally creative ways to let our students educate us. Our students for whom a global horizon comes naturally through the ubiquity of digital technology. Our students who are fired up with a passionate idealism about democracy, human rights, and social and environmental justice, locally, nationally, and globally. And our students who are, and certainly will be, inheriting our dysfunctional democratic institutions and our fractured world, and who we hope will do a better job than we have in managing and healing them into the future. Tomorrow we'll have a chance to introduce the Global Citizenship Fellows Program, and you'll hear from some of our students along these lines. We've got 23 fellows from some 16 countries, 19 Jesuit universities here to share in the assembly with us. One of them doesn't have a passport right now, as I understand it, but we'll remedy that. So we look forward to that conversation tomorrow. In closing, let me just thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections, and I look forward to the conversation.
Tom, thank you so much. Joy James will now present for us. Thank you, Joy.
Good afternoon, dear friends. First of all, I want to congratulate and thank the Latin American team, Father Luis Arriaga and Francisco, for organizing this pre-conference workshop on democracy. Also, I want to thank Father Garanzini and Christy for inviting all the 6 conference people to present the state of democracy in their geographical regions. Of course, we all look forward to the Latin American process of democracy right from the 1960s, where we are the Zelem Conference in Colombia in 1968 in Medellin. Then onwards in India, particularly South Asia, particularly India, we were quite eagerly looking what was the political process that was happening in Latin America. Of course, Paulo Freire and Nestor Paz and Camilo Torres were the heroes of our time at that in 70s. And 70s also we had the result of this process happen in Latin America, particularly in Chile, the Allende being elected and been assassinated by Pinochet, army coup. Later in the 80s, we find Nicaragua, the Sandinista government came into power, leftist government. In that government, there were two priests, ministers, Fernando Cardenal, was a Jesuit, and his brother, Ernesto Cardenal. And we all remember the history, how the Rome came heavily upon them at that time. This was part of history. And we know today the democracy is in shambles. The famous definition of democracy by Abraham Lincoln, it is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But because of the changes that is happening in democracy, we have to recast the whole definition. Now the democracy as the government of the people, or WF. Not by the people, but to by the people. And not for the people, but far away from people. And this is happened all over the world. Democracy is in great threat, it's a great crisis. And how do we look at this? I base my presentation on what is happening in a South Asian country, particularly India. As you know that India is the largest democracy in the world with 1.4 billion people. And the right that people have to vote, but once they finish the voting and elect a government, and the government become autocratic. I will only mention a couple of symptoms that's happening in the country. Later also I will talk about the neighboring countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. One of the things that we found as a symptom of a non-democratic process that's happening in our country is no transparent electoral system with the electronic voting machines being used. Of course, this machine is invented by Japan, but never used them in their country. The misuse of government of the agencies that's supposed to be independent. For example, the Criminal Investigation Agency, National Investigation Agency, including the judiciary. One time we had 2 years ago, 4 Supreme Court judges came in public for a interview, saying that the things that's happening in judiciary, that is Supreme Court, is not favorable to democratic process. That's the first time in the history it happened in our country. Elected representatives of opposition parties are lured with money. People can buy MLAs and MPs for voting for the government, and a number of locally elected groups have been, eroded their power. Large scale of electoral malpractices ruling parties are ignored by the basis of Election Commission. Election Commission is a very independent agency. Somehow it has become the, handmaid of the ruling government. The press has lost its, that power to publish and criticize the government. Once you publish something, you are arrested and put in jail. We have a couple of intellectuals been arrested. And you may remember that one father, Stan Dursamy, a Jesuit, was murdered. It was a judicial murder. He was accused of a crime which he has never committed. We all know him. But he was in the jail and he died there in last year, July 5th. It has become an international news at that time. And there is a law that is Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UPA. With that law, you cannot go to any other court. And you are arrested without and put in jail without trial. And 18 people, intellectuals of our country, are still in jail. And they have no access to the judicial system at the moment. The democratic and constitutional institutions have collapsed and have become subservient to an autocratic executive today. Media and journalists are pressurized not to oppose the government actions. Several journalists and media personnel are languishing in the jail simply for doing their job. Judiciary is crumbling under the pressure of an autocratic executive, lured by the post-retirement benefits. Two of our, the Supreme Court judges, when they retired, one became a governor of a state, another became a member of parliament. So usually, such things happen that it affects their judgments in the, pre-retirement period. Several laws, labor code, farm laws, foreign contribution regulation law, abrogation of the Article 370, it is affecting the Jammu Kashmir area. All these are a brute force majority being passed in the by the ruling government without any discussion in the parliament. The income tax laws and the foreign contribution laws have been restrained the functioning of the sister society. The FCRA registration of the prominent organizations such as Oxfam, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Amnesty International, all been suspended. They are not able to function in our country at the moment. It is not a declared emergency. You remember that in 1975, we had an emergency declared by the Mrs. Gandhi, then Prime Minister. It went on for 18 months. After the 18 months period, election took place and Mrs. Gandhi was routed. So the democracy is at a level of a grassroots level was flourishing. But presently that is not the situation, and India is not unique at this level. It is happening all over the world. And we know that as such, after everything is being said and done, democracy is the best form of government that we have. But how do we handle this case of the democratic elected governments become autocratic and nobody can challenge? The laws are being made that format. Violence against minorities, Dalits, tribals are increasing due to the rise of hate speeches and political polarization in the country. You are aware of the Sri Lanka, what happened. In Sri Lanka, the democratic system has collapsed as people's power has resulted in the president fleeing the country. He's at the moment, he's in Singapore. The government of Singapore has allowed him to stay another 2 weeks. Sri Lanka was turning out to be an autocratic country ruled by the Rajapaksa family. It was a family affair. However, the corrupt political system has collapsed and Sri Lanka stays at an uncertain future today. Bangladesh is ruled by Awami League, which was famous at the time of the forming of the government at that time in 1971. It was part of Pakistan. There was a big war. India took the side with Bangladesh and they were liberated. And Awami League was the ruling party. They are really threatening the opposition teams, and that is the type of democracy that is happening there. Pakistan has a democratically elected government that survives under the shadow of powerful army that has ruled the country for many years. So suddenly the army general becomes the president or prime minister and takes over. This is the history there. Nepal has a fractured democracy with a fragile coalition government that functioned under the secular constitution since 2015. In Myanmar, the army took over the reins of the government after overthrowing the elected government of Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. Bhutan is a democratic constitutional monarchy, which is partially democratic as it has an elected national assembly. In Afghanistan, 2 years ago, you know what happened? The Taliban, the Orthodox Muslim group, has taken over the power, and there is no elected government at the moment. We Jesuits were very much involved in the JRS movement, Jesuit Refugee Service, but we had to withdraw all of them. We were about 10 Jesuits were there and the collaborators, and that is the situation there. And as Father Sosa mentioned that you cannot separate democratic process from the economy of the country. If the economy collapses, democracy will collapse. And that is what happened in the newly small countries with a democratic process. All the countries in South Asia having this constitutional crisis and decline of the constitutional morality and convention of practices. Pakistan and Nepal both are facing similar crunch, and more than once the assault of institutions and dilution of the constitutional provisions to suit the vision of a strong leader enjoying a brute majority. In short, a landslide victory and a charismatic leader do not necessarily ensure either democracy or secularity and prosperity of any country today. Democracy, in any case, is more than a number game. India cannot consider that it is immune to extreme weather events. In the economic environment, like the ones that have played havoc in Sri Lanka, the Reserve Bank of India has recently cautioned us that many of the states in India Union are under the debt burden and need to take stern fiscal measures to avoid spiraling crises. Unfortunately, partisan politics and electoral convulsions make it impossible to deal with the challenges of rationality today. It is no consolation for the suffering Indians to be told that what they are experiencing is a global phenomenon, and there is little our government can do about it. It doesn't have the magic about it. It does not know how to pull out of this crisis. And that is the real crisis that South Asian countries are facing in the name of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Now invite Sophia to the podium.
I'm Ukrainian, and that's my superpower. That's how I start all the presentations in last 5 months, because I'm sure everyone knows where Ukraine is now, how Ukraine is now, and everybody knows how our president is communicating. Today, I will say I'm Ukrainian, and I think I know a lot about crisis and fragility of democracy. As I witnessed as a country which pretended to be democratic turned out to be a terrorist state. Over 5 months of Russia's war in Ukraine, we have witnessed all types of systematic violation of norms of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Deliberate and indiscriminate attacks of civilians, their use as hostages and human shields, execution and rapes, forceful conscription and kidnapping, attacks on medical personnel and facilities, use of banned weapons, and many more. And every time when we think that we have seen everything, we get a new level of emotions and understanding that probably it is not all. Like it happened on July 29th, when 53 Ukrainian servicemen whose evacuation from Azovstal was facilitated by United Nations and Red Cross were tortured and killed to destroy evidence of torturing in Russian prison in Olenivka in Donetsk region. We Ukrainians knew from 2014 annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass that democracy is fragile. And if you believe in it, you have to be ready to stand for it. For human dignity, freedom of speech, civil society, free elections. Things which are often taken for granted in many, many countries. I understand all the concerns about democracy, but I think we are not disappointed in democracy. We are fighting for democracy. Many of my friends, my work colleagues, our students and alumni who are Christians and pray every day, right now, instead of running companies, writing IT code, teaching, developing communities through civil society projects and creating value for others, hold weapons in their hands, fight and pray. They do it to protect our families, to protect Ukraine, and to protect the whole world from Russian terrorism and imperialism. Something that did not appear in a couple of weeks, months, or even years, a phenomenon of Putin which existed and was developing for 22 years, while political leaders in other countries were coming and going, but did not do enough to stop it. Moreover, it is a rebirth of an unreflected enough totalitarian system of Soviets who destroyed millions of people in the 20th century, but were never accountable for these crimes. So lesson number one, freedom and democracy cannot be taken for granted. Lesson number two, war criminals have to be convicted, and only after justice and accountability takes place, we can move into reconciliation. 5 months into Russia's invasion, the education system in Ukraine and the university campuses continue to remain under a threat of deadly missile attacks and bombardments by Russian forces. If you go to the website safeschools.in.ua, you can see that more than 2,000 educational institutions have suffered bombarding and shelling, and 216 of them have been destroyed completely. That's that data of a week ago, so it might change already. At least 183 religious sites were fully or partly destroyed by Russians: churches, mosques, synagogues, and educational and administrative buildings of Ukraine's religious communities. On Friday, July 15, at least 10 Russian missiles, $3 million cost of which, hit 2 universities in the southern city of Mykolaiv. This is just but one set case in terrifying row strikes aimed at the Ukrainian universities since February 24th invasion. The message conveyed by these strikes is nothing less than clear. If universities are frontiers facing the future, there should be no future for Ukraine. Russia itself has unsuppressed challenges in confronting its own future by constantly readjusting and remodeling its own past while being demonstrably frightened and incapable of opening itself to the future. Sadly, Russian futurelessness has become an evil source of deadly destruction and genocide practices on a massive scale. Institutionally speaking, the world hears no words of condemnation on part of Russian universities of war crimes committed by Russian military and its political leadership. To the contrary, the Russian Rectors' Union have backed up Russian leadership in its decision to invade Ukraine. And you can find on one of the websites the long list of Russian institutions who did it. You will be scrolling really long time to see the whole list. So what can we do to avoid crisis and make democracy stronger? We, the universities, are, if I may say, in a generational business, meaning we create the most lasting and cross-generational impacts. Perhaps the most important and transformative impacts when it comes to human personalities, human lives, social and community lives. One thing which we can't allow ourselves to fail at communicating and educating is this: a free society is a moral achievement. A moral achievement which cannot be achieved once and for all and forever. It requires everyone's efforts and commitment. It's a kind of moral victory which is expected of everyone and of all of us and at all times. In essence, this is what unfolds itself in Ukraine now. It's a moral and spiritual combat for freedom and dignity. And this is why our moral victory is of such importance to Ukraine and to the whole world. We as university community are in the combat. This is the right time for us to be authentically what we are and who we are in standing for what is true, good, and holy. This is the source of our resilience and the hope for the future. In this time of crisis, we are blessed by the solidarity of many people, institutions, foundations, associations, including some who are present here. Thank you. Ukrainian Catholic University workload has tripled. We want to make certain that world-class education at our university continues 100% in spite of the brutal, horrid realities of the war. We employ all our faculties and all our people are helping to provide massive humanitarian aid to thousands of people on an uninterrupted basis. UKU already works on future recovery plans for Ukraine into modern state with human being in the center. The next academic year will be transitional for us as an institution. We need to survive, and we have to help to save the country. Help to save the country, not have to help, but help simply. For this reason, we have focused our efforts on developing such a model of international collaboration which would not increase the brain drain from Ukraine, but which would keep our students abroad, but would still allow them to study and be connected with our university. We work actively with the goal to triple the number of need-based scholarships to secure the access to quality higher education for Ukrainian families who suffer hardship during the war, including displaced students. At the same time, we want to develop emerging fields of expertise needed to address the challenges of the post-war recovery and transformation. Any post-war recovery in the country will depend on its ability to retain, engage, and shape professionals. Ukraine will need specialists in so-called emerging fields like refugee studies, security studies, resilience studies, international development or sustainable studies, the European studies, to cope with post-war challenges. There was a moment when we as a university seriously considered the idea of university in exile. We hope we will not have to do it. We believe in our victory, and we know that we will not give up neither our land nor our identity for enemy or terrorists. But we have learned a lot in this period of time, in last months. And the most important thing which we learned, and I would like to repeat myself, a free society is a moral achievement which cannot be achieved once and for all and forever. It requires everyone's effort and commitment. It's a kind of moral victory which is expected of everyone and of all of us at all times. Thank you.
Sophia, thank you so much. Francois, please join us.
First of all, I would like to thank the President and Vice President of AUSJAL, Father Luis Arriaga and Fernando Ponce, and the whole team of AUSJAL for putting together this pre-conference workshop. And of course, thanks also to Father Christy and Father Mike Garanzini and the whole team also of the board for endorsing this pre-conference. However, as I speak, I thought democracy is not just in crisis. At least in Africa, it's agonizing. I come from a country where maybe we are the latest country in the world that experienced a coup d'etat. This is Burkina Faso. And for the last year, that is from 2021 to 2022, there has been 8 coups d'etats on the African continent. And in 5 out of 8 these cases, 5 out of 8, legitimate and democratically elected governments were overthrown by military people. And as a matter of fact, coming back to Burkina Faso, on January 24th, the only democratically elected president ever in Burkina Faso was overthrown by a military coup. And since the independence of Burkina Faso, it experienced no less than 7 coups. And out of 9 presidents who ruled the country, only 2 are civilians. And the very first president who were democratically elected left power to avoid bloodshed between the loyal military and the putschist. As I mentioned already, West Africa alone has experienced 5 coups d'etat, and this has happened in countries that are ranked among the poorest according to the Human Development Index. Now, I suspect that you are feeling so bad, but please forget it. And remember that first, Burkina Faso is a beautiful country located in West Africa. And it's a country that the meaning is, Burkina Faso means country of upright people. Well, not because we are upright, but because we aspire to be upright. But let me talk also about the stable countries in Africa, stable quote unquote. Stable countries where the presidents have been in power for more than 40 years. And the other longer serving presidents have been in power for 40 years, 38 years, 36 years, and only 29 years for the youngest. You have noticed that I have tried to picture 2 extremes, the very unstable countries, and the very stable quote-unquote countries. And they all claim to be democratic countries. So obviously there are countries in the middle also, and these countries in the middle, are those countries that experience some type of democracy according to the definitions that my predecessor mentioned. And out of the 54 countries in Africa, more than 2/3 are living in authoritarian and undemocratic regimes. But why is that the case? And what could our universities do about it? Indeed, by all standards, indexes, and criteria, most African countries are living in authoritarian and undemocratic countries. I see 4 determinants of non-democracy in Africa. The first one is the youth. Both the youth of the country or the people, but also the youth of the countries themselves or the nations. As you all know, 75% of the population in Africa is less than 25 years old. And this makes it very easy to manipulate the population through media. African countries are also very young nations. Except for Ethiopia, most of our countries have been experiencing democracy for less than half a century. And I guess the US experience on January 6th shows that that peaceful transition is not given, even in all countries. The second determinant of non-democracy in Africa is history dependency. What I mean here is that military regime and authoritarian regimes have become the default mode of power transition in Africa, to the point that nobody thinks that democracy is an option. The third reason is resource curse. Most African countries, as you know, have a lot of resources that are exploited by international firms with the direct and indirect support of the nations of these countries. These nations often support regimes that favor their interests. Otherwise, they could also support non-democratic transition of power. In such situations, socio-political instability weakens the bargaining power of legitimate governments, which would then be ready to sell their resources for free to sustain and to survive. In that sense, there is a scramble for African resources, including a scramble for the youth of Africa, as we see spiritual and religious competition. The whole of West and Central Africa, and partly East Africa also, is being devastated actually currently by Islamic aggression. The last determinant of non-democracy in Africa is poverty, vulnerability, and increasing inequalities. 9.2% of the world population lives under poverty, that is with $1.9 per day. But against this background, Africa has 50% poverty rates in rural areas and 10% in urban areas. So the small share of those who did experience democracy are quite disenchanted because it has never delivered economic development for them. Now, given these determinants, what could we do as universities from the standpoint of policy recommendations? The first policy recommendation is civic and political education for the youth. We need to rethink electoral democracy and the whole process of democratization in Africa. And experience has shown that elections are always, often, if not always, times of uncertainty in Africa. So what I call education is a comprehensive type of education that helps the youth and the leaders be agents of positive civic and political change within their countries. The second policy recommendation would be job creation and entrepreneurship development. A very young by idle population is a danger for everyone. And we all recall the Arab Spring and how young people who do not have hope for a better future prefer killing themselves than living a meaningful life. So entrepreneurship provides not only jobs, but only agency. The third policy recommendation would be governance and ethics for the leaders. In order to break the cycle of violence, predation, and political greed, it requires training the leaders for better governance and ethics, because we all know that people don't do bad just because they don't know it. It's a matter of a choice. But it is certainly true also that some political leaders do not necessarily have the right training to understand the full long-term consequences and the extent of their actions. To that extent, good training on governance, leadership, and entrepreneurship could help. And such training also should focus on the military people and the military leaders, because the feeling is that most of them tend to be trained on all paradigms. The last policy recommendation I would suggest is economic development. Pope Paul VI in Populorum Progresso mentioned that development is the new name of peace. When people experience economic and social welfare, they have a stake in peace and democracy. And along the lines of UAPs, we have to accompany the youth to provide them with a future full of hope. We have also to develop a sense that Africa is a common home for all Africans, and that everyone has a right to a good living, taking advantage of the abundant resources of the continent. As someone mentioned to me these days, he said, Africa was a priority during the 35th General Congregation of the Jesuits. And with the UAPs, Africa is still at the forefront because Africa has the most important concentration of youth in the world. We have quite substantial natural resources, not only for Africa, but I would say for the entire world. The Congo Basin alone is considered as the second lung of the world. So in conclusion, I would mention that democratic the democratic diagnosis of Africa is not as beautiful as we hoped it would be. And the determinants I highlighted show how we can contribute as universities through civic and political education of the youth, through job and entrepreneurial training, through governance promotion and economic development. Our universities in Africa are called to be agents of change, to be agents of peace, to be agents of reconciliation, and my hope is that we build on the experience of our sister universities in the IAJU network. So I hope that I can count on all our regional associations also for support and for collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. Our final presenter is Johannes, and at the conclusion of his talk, I hope that those of you who can stay beyond the 4 o'clock hour, we could entertain at least a couple of questions. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored given an opportunity to share shortly my understanding of democracy in Asia Pacific. However, I am from Indonesia, therefore my perspective will be much influenced by Indonesian context. First, Asia Pacific region is highly diverse in culture, religion, language, country size, population, governance model, and level of economic development. A similar diversity is regime type and performance among the regime democracies. At the same time, Asia Pacific has high potential to contribute to the development of democracy, for it has two very highly populated countries, China and Indonesia. More than that, Indonesia is the highest number of Muslims in the world. But interestingly, it is not an Islamic country, but a secular democratic country. In the last 10 years, most countries in Asia Pacific have maintained their regime type and enjoy political stability, except Myanmar, that became an authoritarian regime following the military coup in 2021. Over the last decade, rising nationalism has led to the infusion of religion and politics in Asia Pacific, especially in Indonesia. Such tendencies contribute to the weakening of democracy by undermining pluralism, increasing societal polarization, and in the worst case, heightening conflict. Several countries in which ethno-nationalism, ethnic and religious play a significant role in politics have also undergone a deepening polarization. Particularly in Southeast Asia, this trend could further deepen the pandemic socio-economic impacts, intensifying existing societal polarization and carrying serious consequences for minority population. In recent years, the phenomenon of ethno-nationalist mobilization, sometimes accompanied by a religious dimension, has been growing in both authoritarian and democratic countries. In democracies, this is a cause for concern since it goes against the progressive trend of a deepening of universal citizenship and inclusive management of diversity. The other issue is that we cannot deny that democracy has been significantly affected by digital disruption. This includes the emergence of powerful new mechanisms of control and manipulation, powerful surveillance technologies to fake news, online bots, and unregulated contact tracing. All these phenomena are in plentiful evidence across the Asia-Pacific region, bringing with them new challenges to every aspect of public and private life, institution, legal framework, media practices, and accountability framework. In a number of countries in the region, democratization has not served as an antidote to corruption. The reasons for this are multiple and relate not only to formal rules or institutional development, but also to inherited social norm and the informal inner working of politics and its call for more comparative research. Based on these opportunities and challenges, Jesuit universities across Asia Pacific face some challenges below. First, encouraging students to actively involve in variety of social organizations. Through these activities, students could naturally grow and develop their public leadership skill. However, it is not easy to encourage this, for they tend to be busy already with their academic activities, and they prefer to join hobbies and fun-oriented activities. Secondly, aligned with the increasing role of social media and digital technology in political life, we need to develop our student critical thinking. Through such competence, they can be better discern and reflect to highly intensive information from social media. It will be good if we could also encourage our students to actively participate in countering hoax and fake news. Third, since ethno-nationalism is a global phenomenon in politics, and in Indonesia it is called identity politics, we should encourage students and lecturers to involve and be active in some organization that is not based on common or similar religion, race, or ethnicity. It is not easy for our Christian students, where they are minority, because every group of this activity will make them a minority in their organization or their activity. Of course, as a university, our concern should be on research and publication. Since 8 years ago, in case of Sanata Dharma University, we have established a Center of Study on Democracy and Human Rights. So we agree with what AUSJAL doing in response to the democracy and politics nowadays. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, and let's give some gratitude to all of our panelists this afternoon. Okay, let's make time for a couple of questions. If you're so inclined, please introduce yourselves and your affiliation, and to whom you would like to address the question, let us know. You know, they say in teaching you're supposed to allow students seven seconds or something like that. So, anyone? Oh, please. Thank you.
Hi there. Serena Cosgrove from Seattle University. In the earlier part of the afternoon, Father Luis Arriaga asked us for best practices. We should be sharing them, right? And as we hear from other regions of the world, makes me think that maybe there's a time for more solidarity. And I think sometimes how to do that between universities when we all face so many challenges is a really important question to ask. So I would start with Vice Rector Opatska, and then panelists to talk where universities from other parts of the world have really stood up, have walked with you. Looked like. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. We get it a lot, and well, I can give very interesting example how Notre Dame University in the United States stood with us. We had relations for last probably 15 years already. They have been with us on the calls, 30 minutes calls, for last 5 months, sometimes every week, sometimes every second week, sometimes once per 3 weeks. But they just were talking to us, and they really wanted to understand what is the situation and how we are doing and how they can help. They also came up with a big opportunity for our students. So 30 students of UCU will be going for mobility program this year to Notre Dame. And actually, this is also something we sent a letter to universities with whom we partnered before, and we said, we call it network of solidarity, and we asked if you can take 1 student, or maybe you can take 2 students, or maybe you, like Notre Dame, can take 30 students, but take them because all of them indeed want to stay in Ukraine, but this is not a safe place for them. We are saying that they need to learn, they need to build networks. We are saying that that's not their time yet, though they are very engaged, very much helping, very committed, but it's not their time yet. And this is what we have been asking a lot of universities, and overall next year, more than 250 students will be going for various mobilities. For us, it's important that they can study normally, that they have this normality. We also have some joint research things going on, starting right now, because Ukraine is a place where you can do very interesting researches now, having interviews, talking to people, observing. You can use different methods, but that's definitely the place to explore. And just as I said, constant conversations, I value them maybe not less than 30 students which are taken by Notre Dame. Thank you.
Please, welcome.
Hi, my name is Channing. I'm a student at Georgetown. Thanks so much for your presentation. I don't know if I'm supposed to be the one asking a question, but I hear a lot of mention of people in my age group. So I wanted to ask, it seems like a lot of weight is being put on our shoulders as youth. Happy to take on the challenge, but maybe if you can share a little bit of what your universities are doing to bridge that gap between that research and publication on democracy and the fact that youth need to be involved. Have you had initiatives and programs and events to bridge that? You'll hear more about this Global Citizenship Fellow that I'm a part of, but are there more specific programs at your universities, and maybe are there ways to collaborate on that, especially as this network of Jesuit universities? Thank you.
Go ahead, Tom.
So I think just to paraphrase the question, what are we doing in our own local contexts that we could share in terms of educating students for citizenship, but also engaging the wider political environment. In Washington, D.C., just by virtue of our location, we're able to convene a lot of conversations, and we try our best to have an impact on public policy and the like, working with other Jesuit universities. We bring students into those efforts, but clearly it has to be the whole university engaged in that kind of public outreach, but maybe the colleagues can give some examples.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned, in Africa, we have 75% of our population, which is 25 years old at the most. And if you meet with the African delegation here, you would see that most of us, we are about to start new programs, new universities, because the demand is very high. So I would say that we have identified that it's important for us to accompany the youth along the lines, of course, of the UAPs, but to make sure that this youth is not manipulated by political leaders, but that they become rather agents of positive change for themselves, but also for others. Thank you.
Thanks, Francois. Last question.
Yeah, it's less a question than a remark. It's just to be short. I'm Alain Thomaset from Centre CF Paris, the Jesuit faculties. It's the remark from a French philosopher, Montesquieu, who said that for dictatorship, we need only fearful people who are fear of the power. But for democracy, we need to have virtuous citizenship. So maybe our job is to train our students to be virtuous persons. It's not easy.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you all for your active participation. Lots of opportunities to network during the week. Have a great meeting, everyone. Thank you.